Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and if you're a brand new subscriber to my channel, then welcome aboard, and thanks for helping us head towards that 19,000 subscribers total, and thanks to each and every one of you out there for your continuing support of my channel. Now we're going to continue by taking a look at some of the very special machines that we came across at this year's 2024 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. We all already had a look at that lovely ATK 250, but this next machine is an even rarer bike than the American-made ATK, and this C20 CCM that we're going to take a look at is the only one of its kind in existence. So let's jump straight into that video and let's take a look. Okay, so as I mentioned, this was another quite rare bike that I spotted at the Telford show this year, and although we did have a brief look at this bike in one of the Telford episodes, if you remember, I did say at that time that we'd have a much closer look at this machine as soon as we were done with the Telford stuff, and so true to my word, here's a bit of background and a little bit more information on the bike's construction. And so essentially this bike here is a CCM prototype with a 1991 CCM frame and a very unique twin cam 605cc Rotax 4-stroke engine, which at the time it was really just a bit of an experimental power plant that Alan Clues was developing with a view to launching a completely new bike early sometime in 1992. But our particular story starts back in 1998 when Rob Hughes and the bike's builder Alec Middleton came across what they thought was an old Works CCM chassis from the 1990s. And because Rob already has one of the most comprehensive collections of CCMs in Europe, both Alec and himself thought that the frame would be a very good, valuable asset to add to his CCM racing history. Anyhow, after closer inspection, they then noticed that the frame had a few more engine mounting points in it than a stock standard C20 or even C25 Clues Classic, which was very unusual, and it had them both kind of baffled, but thankfully the great Alan Clues was still around to help them with that mystery, and after a quick phone call, Alan then told Rob and Alec that this particular chassis here was actually registered to Alan's son Austin, who did some development work on the bike in its early years. But when Alec and Rob first picked up this bike, it had the lesser single cam Rotax engine, which when it was bolted into the frame there were still mounting holes that looked additional to the actual mountings for that particular engine, and it was again Alan Clues who supplied the answers. Now Alan told them that this frame here originally had the twin cam Rotax engine in it when it was being evaluated and trialled by the great Perry Leask, who after various shakedown races to check out the big engine's suitability as a motocross plant, it turns out that the power delivery of this big twin cam engine was deemed unsuitable as a motocross engine because the power wasn't low down where it would do its best work, and the additional bulkiness and weight on the top half of the engine didn't outweigh the power advantages of the single cam Rotax engine, and it said that it was only an extra 10 horsepower more than the stock Rotax single cam. So what Alan Clues did then was he just simply scrubbed the idea of the big twin cam motor, and then he fitted a stock single overhead cam Rotax engine, which Perry Leask then used as a spare bike when he raced it for CCM in 1992. Nevertheless, Alec and Rob were still determined to bring the original twin cam and chassis back to life once again, and armed with just some basic specifications and a few black and white pictures from newspaper cuttings from back in the day, they then set about its full restoration, and what you see here is the result of their months of hard work and labours. But there's certainly no question about this bike's rarity and pedigree, because as far as I know, there's only one of these bikes out there, and Alec, I must say, has done another fantastic job here resurrecting yet one more Clues Lost Classic, and Rob Hughes, the bike's owner, and Alec Middleton, the bike's builder, are certainly doing the motocross world a huge service by bringing back these long lost CCM racers, and if it wasn't for the both of them, then we wouldn't be able to see or even learn about these kind of rare and unknown British made classics. But this was still the very first time that our CCM Rotax had appeared at the Telford show, and as you'd expect, it was causing quite a bit of interest with all of the dirt bike fans mulling around the halls, and many of them didn't even have a clue as to what they were actually looking at, but certainly the Telford judges knew exactly what they were looking at, so much so that the bike was awarded the Best Motocross Machine Award, which was quite an achievement considering the hundreds of immaculate bikes that were on display at this year's show. And so let's just take a look at this monster Rotax motor, which they say back in 1991 it was Alan Clues who was looking at expanding their motocross range, and they were looking for a big four-stroke with a lot more power than the normal Rotax thumper engines of the day, and something that could certainly take on the big bore two-strokes that were dominating motocross at that time. So Alan Clues was then working alongside the Rotax engineers to help them come up with this brand new twin cam 605 engine that Alan could then bolt into his C20 CCM chassis. And basically this is what they came up with, this big double overhead cam single cylinder four-stroker, which at that time actually had a water-cooled cylinder head, but the actual cylinder barrel was still air-cooled in the conventional fashion, which Alan Clues later modified to make the motor oil-cooled rather than have two different fluids of oil and water running through the motor. And the overall horsepower was said to be around the 66 bhp mark, and the entire completed bike was finished for the end of 1991, and it was Alan's son Austin who rode the bike at its first ever event in Kendal sometime later. And also Rotax originally supplied Alan Clues with a set of camshafts with relatively mild profiles on them, but sometime later Rotax intended to supply Alan with a variation of camshafts as the engine was being developed. And once again, and just as in the single cam version of this motor, the camshafts are again belt driven and accessed just behind this cover here, running down this left hand side of the engine. Now, when Alan Clues changed the water cooling to an oil cooling system, he just simply blocked off the water pump, and then he used the left side frame chassis rail as an oil tank, and two small oil coolers assisted the engine's cooling, and these were situated just above the engine and behind those air scoops. But as I said, the barrel part of the motor was still air-cooled in the conventional manner. And so to supply the big double overhead cam Rotax with its fuel, this engine was originally designed to be fed by a pair of twin 36mm Delorto carburetors, or there was an option of just using a single 40mm Delorto. So you can gather that this big beastie here was certainly going to swallow some gas during a race event, and it was because of that aforementioned twin carb setup that this engine also had a triple spark plug arrangement, just to make sure that all of that fuel was burnt completely inside the cylinder head, and all three spark plugs fired at exactly the same time. So another interesting feature on this very unique motor. And once again, on the transmission side of the engine, I'm pretty sure that the stock original clutch would have also been slightly beefed up to cope with the increase in power that this Rotax motor was now developing. And I'm not entirely sure as to what it would have been like to get it fired up with that Kickstarter there, but of course there was a decompressor to help you out. But I can imagine that it would have taken quite a hefty boot and maybe even a bit of swearing to get this big beastie bursting into life. And in this shot here, you can see that this is the rear brake pedal arrangement on this right hand side, with the hydraulic master cylinder there, which looks quite close to that primary drive sprocket and chain. So you'd certainly not want that chain to break, because it could cause all manner of problems if it got caught in that hydraulic cylinder while it was running at full pelt. But no question, it's certainly a big brute of an engine, and it's a bit of a pity that after all of the upgrades and development of this motor, that it didn't actually measure up in terms of its performance and power on the track. Because initially, Alan Clues certainly had high hopes of developing, marketing and eventually using this engine in his 1992 CCM range, where it was going to be offered as a works replica, although at the end of the day, unfortunately, it wasn't all that it was expected, which is why Alan Clues then just decided to forget the project and retrofit a stock standard Rotax 4-stroke instead. And so as we switch to the front end of our C20, it was a traditional pair of white power 4054 upside down forks, which were more or less a standard fitment on most of the CCM C20 and C25 bikes of the 1990s. And these white power suspension systems for their day were certainly up there with some of the best available at that time. But as you'd expect, they did have quite a good bit of scope in order to tune them with regards rebound or compression. Now, to stop our Rotax CCM in full flight, it was a twin pot Grimeka hydraulic disc brake here at the front, which even for the 1990s wasn't mega powerful, but these still did a very good job of slowing or stopping our C20 while it was flying along. Okay, it wasn't the world's best ever motorcycle brake, but it was still a massive improvement over the old school shoe and drum type systems of the 1970s and 1980s. So here at the back end of our CCM racer, it was again another white power single piggyback monoshock unit that was used to keep the rear of the bike in check, and this was simply bolted onto the frame at the top of the shock and onto another mount here at the bottom. But as per the front forks, this unit again was a very good quality suspension shock with plenty room for any tuning or adjustments. Now moving on to the bike's swing arm, we can see it's just a simple alloy box section type of unit that was normally quite strong and very light, being made from alloy rather than heavier steel. And also here at the back it was once again a twin piston Grimeka caliper and disc brake as its rear anchor. Although this rear disc was slightly smaller than the front item, but then again most of the braking on our big thumper would have been done by that much stronger and beefier front disc arrangement. Now, of course, both of the front and the rear wheels on our 1990s Rotax racer aren't the original items that were fitted to the bike at Clues HQ back in the day, but these fantastic looking gold anodized rims are certainly all brand new with a nice shiny spokes there as well, all mated to the bike's original hubs. Of course, the bike has a plastic fuel tank, and you can just imagine that when this bike and the engine in particular had those twin Delortos to feed with its fuel, it would have swallowed the gas at quite an alarming rate. So I'd imagine that you'd certainly have to top this tank up before it headed to the start line. But the rest of the bike's plastics, including the front and the rear mudguards, and of course these radiator scoops, are all in fantastic condition. And actually where Alec got these parts to build the bike, I don't actually know, because original C20 or even C25 CCM plastics are almost impossible to find nowadays. So as we move on to the seat on our quite rare DOHC racer, this is your typical modern bike racing seat that continues over the rear of the bike's fuel tank, just in order that the rider has as much scope as possible to enable him to go as far forward as he can, just to help the bike make sharper turns when he's going into the corners. And of course, if need be, he can also put his weight right at the rear of the bike if he wants to keep that front end as light as possible as he bombs along the straightaways. But I have to say that Alec has certainly captured the colour scheme of these bikes from the 1990s, because it seemed that at that time pink was the colour of the day in that era, and it wasn't only the bike's plastics and seats that were decked out in pink. Much of the riders' racewear of that time as well also favoured pink for some strange and unexplainable reason. So as we move on to the pilot's control centre of our rare British built classic, it's a pair of rental handlebars there with all of the associated grips, master cylinder for the front brake, and alloy ball end levers, which of course had those black rubber cable covers as well to help stop mud, dirt and moisture from entering the cable ends. Now also on the clutch side we had all of the important decompressor controls so that you could set that big thumper motor into the correct position for starting it up, because with this engine being a big double overhead cam job at the top, then I'd expect that this decompressor lever would be one of the most important parts on this bike. And of course, for super safety and just in case anything went wonky with the Rotax engine and you needed to stop it in a hurry, it was a simple case of just pressing this kill switch here to stop all of the sparks inside the cylinder, therefore, of course, killing the motor. And once again, here's the throttle twist grip gasser that had the job of controlling all of those horses waiting to be released from that twin cam Rotax power plant. So another important part on this C20. Although there was a couple of things that we didn't mention on our quick tour of this double overhead camshaft motor was that Rotax originally fitted much larger than stock valves inside the cylinder head of this engine, with the inlet valve being 38mm and the exhaust, I think, was 32mm. And Rotax also said that this test engine had fairly mild camshaft lobe profiles, but as I said earlier, they were going to provide Alan Clues with a selection of other different camshafts with various other cam lobe profiles, so that Alan could fine-tune the motor to his own specific requirements. And again, I'm pretty sure that you're already aware that these Rotax four-strokes, including the stock standard single cam motors, had a single cylinder, but they also had a twin exhaust port cylinder head that had these twin header pipes that wrapped around this right-hand side of the engine, where it then joined into this quite big alloy tailpipe here at the rear. And it is a bit of a pity that this bike was actually on display indoors, because you can only imagine the sound that comes out of the end of this rear tailpipe when that twin cam Rotax engine gets fired into life. Although I have to say that Alec Middleton certainly come up trumps once again, because as you know, Alec's built and restored quite a few of the bikes in Rob's CCM collection over the years, and when it comes to these Clues classics, Alec certainly knows his way around them, and we've certainly featured plenty examples of Alec's handiwork here on my channel in the past. Although the point to remember here is that when Alec began the rebuild of this quite rare machine, there were no drawings, plans or specifications to use as a reference point, because after all, this was still essentially a prototype bike, and the only references that Alec had to give him a guide as to how the bike looked in the early 1990s were just a couple of old newspaper black and white pictures and some article paragraphs on its sum of parts. But by all accounts, the very few people who'd actually seen this bike back in the day, they still say that Alex absolutely nailed it first time out. And so it's a very big thanks to Alec and of course the bike's owner Rob Hughes that yet another piece of CCM history has been saved. A bike that probably none of us will have ever even known about if it hadn't been for Rob and Alec rescuing it and bringing it back to life. So this is another CCM classic that's going to take pride of place among the rest of Rob's CCMs, who now has currently in his possession an example of every single CCM motocrosser Alan Clues ever made. So when we come back to CDB TV, we're going to take a deeper look into another classic that we found at Telford, and next up it's the turn of Steve Coughlin's 1988 RM250 Suzuki, another absolute belter of a bike from this year's Telford show. So make sure that you join me to take a look at this very nice classic. So that's all for this edition of Classic Dirt Bike TV, and until next time, it's cheerio for now.